Before we get started this week, I wanted to make my Kentucky listeners aware of House Bill 137 and Senate Bill 89, two bills currently being considered by our state legislature. House Bill 137 aims to restrict air quality enforcement and will directly harm vulnerable communities, like those in eastern Kentucky and West Louisville. Senate Bill 89 would allow pollutants, contaminants, sewage, and more hazardous substances into our groundwater and waterways, including those that provide Kentuckians with drinking water. To quote today's guest, Silas House, "Water is life. Water is our most precious natural resource, and we must protect it at all costs. Kentuckians, please contact your representatives and urge them to vote against SB 89 and HB 187. Thanks." When I think of Gene Ritchie, I think of my childhood. In elementary school, we were taught how to play the dulcimer. Just one song, don't ask me how to play it. But at this time, I didn't recognize the significance of this instrument to Appalachian culture. I didn't even realize what being Appalachian meant. I also wasn't really aware of Jean, who popularized this instrument in our culture and spent her life representing Appalachian people throughout the world. This week, I spoke with Silas House about Gene Ritchie's life and legacy. Silas is a New York Times bestselling author, environmental and LGBTQ activist, Grammy nominee, and is currently serving as Kentucky's Poet Laureate. Also, speaking from my own experience, he's a great wedding officiant. Silas was also lucky enough to be friends with Gene, and it was a real pleasure to speak with him about Gene's life, family, international legacy, and the way she embodied Appalachia through and through. Oh, and spoiler alert for those who haven't seen the Bob Dylan biopic Complete Unknown, we discuss it broadly during this episode, but I promise we don't spoil too much. Now, please join Silas and I as we discuss the wonderful Gene Ritchie. So glad to have you on. We're here to talk about Gene Ritchie and why she's so important to Appalachian culture and folk music culture writ large. And I know you knew Gene Ritchie, so you kind of have a special connection. So yeah, just kick off and tell us a little bit why she's so important to our culture and what she did, and go for it.
Well, first of all, I want to say how happy I am that you're doing this podcast. I think it's really important work, and you are really preserving a lot of stories that have been forgotten, that need to be more widely known. And I think Gene Ritchie is a perfect person for that. So just to quickly summarize, some of the reasons I think of her as one of our mountain laurels is that she was a writer, she was a musician, she built instruments, she was an activist. She was from this family that's responsible for preserving hundreds of songs that would have been lost otherwise. I think she was probably the most visible Appalachian person of the 1950s nationally. She transformed American music. She's known as the mother of folk music. She popularized the dulcimer. She stood up to Bob Dylan, which I love. She risked her entire career to speak out against the coal industry. She was an early ally for LGBTQ people, and she spent her later years active in the fight to preserve the music and the mountains. And I was so lucky to get to know her and to call her my friend in her later years and to hear a lot of her stories from her own telling. But I guess we should start with her childhood. Jean's importance in our history and culture starts even before she was born, because the Ritchie family were known as one of the singing families of Appalachia. They lived in Viper, which is in Perry County. To me, that feels very central to Eastern Kentucky, and sort of like, if I picture Central Appalachia, that's sort of like the heart of it, the center of it. Well, the Ritchie family were known for their vast knowledge of old songs, many of which were brought over from Ireland and Scotland and England and Wales. And most of these were variants that they had changed to have Appalachian locales or references. And Gene's father had even collected enough songs to make a book called Lover's Melodies. He published that in about 1911. And that's probably what brought Cecil Sharp to the family. And Cecil Sharp is one of the most famous song catchers. He came to them in 1917. And just for anybody that may not know, a song catcher was basically someone who was interested in preserving and writing down the folk songs. So they would come into rural areas to record and transcribe the songs. And We should also mention here that the Ritchie family was very involved with the Hyman Settlement School, and that's a school that continues to be really important in our region, and it's gone through different iterations. At this time, it was a folk school where students were taught a classical education, but they were also taught to be proud of their heritage and their culture in a time when most people in the region were not being taught that by the rest of the country. I mean, to a large degree, we're still taught that, right? To be
Yeah.
ashamed, to be proud. But anyway, Gene's father was also devoted to the dulcimer, and he passed his love for this instrument on to his children, especially Gene. Later, another famous song catcher, Alan Lomax, visited and recorded the Ritchie family. And so I have a little quote that he wrote about them that I love. He wrote, "They were quiet, thoughtful folks who went in for ballads, big families, and educating their children. Gene's grandmother was a prime mover in the Old Regular Baptist Church. Gene's father taught school. He printed a newspaper, fitted specs, meaning glasses. He farmed and sent 10 of his 14 children to college." End quote. So, unlike a lot of men of the time, Gene's father was adamant that his daughters get educations and even college educations. One of my favorite things about Gene is her 1955 memoir or autobiography, or however you want to call it. It's called Singing Family of the Cumberlands. And I just want more people to know about this book. I think the title is a testament to Gene's lack of ego. She's given this chance to tell her story, but she shines all the light on her family, really. It's an underrated book. It should be more widely read. And anyone who claims to have a vast knowledge of Appalachian culture and literature must read it. I teach this book in my Appalachian literature classes at Berea College, and I always say that it's among the first instances of claiming one's Appalachian identity that we have in our literature. So remember, she was the youngest of 14 children, which I can't even wrap my mind around. And the book often homes in on these moments of her feeling like wrapped up in her family and loved by them, but she also sometimes feels alone and she feels different. And the book has so many beautiful passages, but there's one in particular I want to share. It's pretty short. This is from the Singing Family of the Cumberlands. "I watched the brightening sky and was proud that I could feel the frail beauty of it. I felt proud of my lonesome feelings. I felt proud that I was who I was. I wondered if anyone would ever understand how much was in my mind and heart. I wondered if ever there'd come somebody who would know. You couldn't talk about such things. You had to talk about corn and dishes and brooms and meetings and lengths of cloth and lettuce beds. If you should start to talk about the other things, the things inside you, folks might think you were getting above your raising, highfalutin. Maybe I was the only one. Maybe nobody else in this world felt the things I felt and thought the things I thought in my mind." It just gives me chills. It gives me goosebumps.
Yeah, I love that. I relate to that so much.
Right.
Yeah.
I know we still feel that way, you know? It's like, I think one thing about being Appalachian is often that you feel like an insider to the culture, but you can also often feel like an outsider to the culture. And she just articulates that beautifully. It also just really captures her intelligence, you know, and her defiance. And so I don't think enough people think about Gene Ritchie as a writer, but it's one of the main things that she identified as. She was really proud of her writing, and it's the major way I think of her. She published several books in her lifetime, but that one was really celebrated. It was published by the Oxford University Press, and it got a lot of attention when it came out in 1955. So the book really paints a picture of a lost way of life in the region, especially about singing families, which most people don't even know what that is. You know, I mean, I did until I read this book. But singing families were families that used music throughout their daily lives. They had songs for work, for learning, for discipline, for romance, for dancing, for playing, for everything they had a song. And, you know, if you were with Jean, she would do that. You know, whatever, you'd be walking down the street with her or whatever, and she would start singing a song that she, you know, identified with an activity. And then she would tell the story of how her family used those, so they had certain songs that they sang when they were harvesting corn, or when they were breaking beans, or when they were sweeping the porch, or when they were, doing games out in the yard and things like that. And so around the time the book came out in 1955, Jean was so well known that NBC sent a camera crew to Viper, and they filmed her family getting ready for Christmas. And so if you watch that video, you get a good idea of how they use these songs to get through their daily lives. In the film, they're making like little dolls, I think, or something like that. And they all just start in unison singing this song that everyone know. And it is so deeply moving to watch it. And you can watch that if you just go to YouTube and type in Ritchie Family Christmas. And there's actually a really great archive of videos of Jean singing on YouTube. And another one that I love is her and her sister Edna singing The Four Marys on their family's front porch in Viper in the 1960s. Jean's husband was a photographer, and so that led to there being a great documentation. And he often would take his moving camera as well. And they were, they lived most of their lives in New York. They lived on Long Island, so they were real connected with a lot of media people as well. And that's another reason that she was always on TV in the 1950s. And not many Appalachian people were, and when they were usually like in a quote unquote hillbilly costume, which Jean just didn't go in for that. They were, more all costumed up to sell records or whatever, and she just never did that. She was just presenting herself in this very dignified way, always.
Yeah, whenever I think of her, I always picture her just sort of maybe in a sundress or something, or just, just like elegant kind of. Appalachian
Right.
elegant, some people think of elegant, they're like sparkly rhinestones. That's not what I'm talking about.
She was so elegant and so dignified, and was very aware of how important her appearance was to negating a lot of those stereotypes, especially at a time when Nashville was, putting people on stage in like blacked out teeth and their clothes all tore up, and things like that to sell quote unquote hillbilly records. So she was really fighting against that in real subtle and overt ways. Well, that sort of takes us up to when she went away to college. She didn't go too far. She went down to Whitley County. That's where I was born. And she got her undergrad degree at what was then called Cumberland Junior College. It's now University of the Cumberlands. She studied for 2 years there. Then she got her bachelor's in social work at UK. And there she was very involved in the choir, and she studied piano. Slipped into my home language there for a minute. Forgot I was on the podcast.
Hey, it's welcome here.
So immediately after graduating, she took a job with the Henry Street Settlement School, which is still in the Lower East Side of New York City. I think this is so interesting because we associate settlement schools with rural areas, but they were also in the underserved urban areas. And probably the most famous settlement school is like the Adams House, right? The Jane Addams House in Chicago. I can't remember what it was called, but a lot of people know about it. But she was employed on the Lower East Side as a social worker, but she also taught mountain songs and traditions to the children there. And her singing caught the attention of her coworkers. And they, really prodded her to sing in public. She was a little hesitant to do that, but eventually she started singing at coffee houses and bars and little folk music venues. And she became really good friends with people like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, and Oscar Brand and Alan Lomax. And these people were really ahead of their time in collecting and preserving the music of the rural working class. And they knew Jean was the real deal. She wasn't just singing about the rural experience. She had actually lived it. She had been out there pulling corn and singing these songs. So by the late 1940s, she's singing all over the West Village. And that's really important to know because she was doing this at least a dozen years before Bob Dylan or Joan Baez ever came to the village. Although both of them get far more attention for their roles in the folk movement. as early as 1948, Jean was singing on stage with Woody Guthrie, and by 1952, she had been recorded by the Library of Congress and released her first album. And again, with that album, she put the focus on her people. She called it Jean Ritchie Singing the Traditional Songs of Her Kentucky Mountain Family. And this album was from Elektra, and this was a big label at the time. It was from Warner Brothers, and it's especially important because Elektra is widely considered for having a huge role in the development of folk and rock music. And around this time in 1950, she married George Pico, who was also active in the music scene. And I'm sure there are people listening who knew him, and he was just such a wonderful man, a great character. He photographed album covers and publicity photos for people like Judy Collins, Little Richard, Louis Armstrong. He was just very involved in the music scene in New York.
So
and they met.
Was he from New York? Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, he was raised in New York.
Okay.
They lived in Port Washington, which is out on Long Island. So they weren't in like Manhattan, but they were really close to New York City and spent a lot of time there. And so they later had two sons together, and I'll get back to them eventually. But something really important that happened shortly after they got married is that Jean got a Fulbright scholarship. So she and George traveled to Ireland and the British Isles to find the origins of songs that she and her family and neighbors had preserved in Appalachia. She wanted to trace them backwards, to see how they sounded back in the old country and how we had changed them in Appalachia. So first she typed out all the 300 songs that she had learned in her own community. And then they spent about a year and a half traveling to villages all over Wales and Scotland and Ireland and England. And they would find people who were singing these songs or variations of them. They interviewed them, they recorded them singing. George made beautiful photographs of them. And in doing so, they created a really important archive of history and culture. And at the National University of Ireland at Galway, they now have the George Pico archives, and you can go in there and see all of his pictures that he took while they were over there and hear all the recordings. They also have the Jean Ritchie lecture in her honor every year. Somebody comes in and talks about the Appalachian Ireland connections. So, she formed long friendships there and these connections that still exist today. While she was in England, she performed at the Royal Albert Hall, which is one of the, great music venues in the world. And she also visited with one of the world's greatest composers, a favorite of mine, Ralph Vaughan Williams. He wrote beloved pieces such as The Lark Ascending, which is the most beloved piece of classical music for British people. And so, she was really a mover and a shaker, and she was so knowledgeable in so many ways and making all these connections that we benefit from today. In fact, there is, because of that Jean Ritchie connection, there is now an exchange between Berea College and the National University of Ireland at Galway, where two students get to go to graduate school in Galway from Berea every year. Two of them get to go over there for the year of their graduate studies. And that's all, you can trace that right back to Jean and the connections she made there.
I was going to ask, you've been to Galway, right? Have you been to those archives?
Yeah. I got to do the Jean Ritchie lecture in 2015. I did that. And then before that, in 2013, I took, with a colleague of mine, 22 students to Ireland. And one of the things we did on our trip was go to those archives. And all the students sang a Jean Ritchie song together for the people there. And it was just really moving and beautiful. And, and those connections are still thriving. So we owe a lot to Jean and George for those connections.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I think that's probably the reason we see local acts, like the local Honeys, go over to Ireland, because of the connection she made.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, when you're in Ireland, more people, would know, probably, I would think, more people know who Jean Ritchie is just out in Ireland than they do in most of America. They just they think about music in a different way, and they really love folk music
Mm-hmm.
deeply. I mean, there are a lot of acts, like modern acts right now that have followings in the United States, but they're like the Beatles in the UK and Ireland stuff, when they go over there. Anyway, it's interesting the way that those connections. Well, that takes us up to the 60s, and this was a time of great productivity for Jean. She was releasing albums, she was on TV shows, she was performing everywhere, and the folk scene that she had helped to create in New York was blowing up. People like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were becoming more commercially minded. They knew how to take this traditional sound and shape it to make it more commercial. Jean refused to change the traditional sound of the music, though, and she refused to change herself to fit that commerciality. In Dylan's memoir, he wrote that when he first arrived in New York City, quote, the women singers in folk music were performers like Peggy Seeger and Jean Ritchie, and they didn't translate well to a modern crowd. Well, I think it's important to point out here that Jean had started popularizing folk music in New York City as early as 1948, when little Bob Dylan was only 7 years old. And by 1951, a full decade before Dylan ever even pursued singing, she was signed to Elektra. So this is all really timely because of the recent film, A Complete Unknown, about Bob Dylan. And it's set during this period when folk music was blowing up. And despite the fact that Jean is known as the mother of folk, she's never mentioned in the film. A major part of the movie focuses on the Newport Folk Festival. She was one of its original directors, and she performed there throughout the 60s, yet she's never mentioned in the film. Instead, all the attention goes to the men who directed the festival with her, chiefly Alan Lomax and Pete Seeger. And of course, most of the attention is on Dylan himself. Now, I find this really troubling because it's another case of an Appalachian and a woman being cut out of the story. I wrote an essay about this that I hope people will look for if they want to know more. They can find that just by Googling my name on Substack. The other important thing that I want to point out about this period is that in 1963, Jean actually threatened a lawsuit against Bob Dylan. So to get all of that right, I'll read a short passage from my essay about this. Now, I really want to hear your thoughts about A Complete Unknown.
Oh, yeah.
So this is from my essay, just quickly. Because of her high, sweet voice, many sometimes thought that Jean Ritchie was a timid, fainting presence. She was anything but. She was fierce, keenly intelligent, formidable, and she never minded letting people know what she thought. And when she heard Masters of War, one of Dylan's most popular songs on his 1963 album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, the recording that first made him a national sensation, she let him know how upset she was that he had used her family's melody for the arrangement of the song Nottingham Town without giving her or them songwriting credit. She first recorded Nottingham Town almost a decade before Dylan released Masters of War. The melody of the song, which he used, was created by the Ritchie family and further fine-tuned by Jean herself. Yet Dylan gave her zero credit for the creation of the song, even after he knew she was responsible for it. He is one of our greatest songwriters and artists, and I love his music. So I'm not here to hate on Bob Dylan, but I am here to critique him and to call him out. And I think it's important to do that with the artists we love. I wish he had done a better job of rectifying this oversight and of respecting her properly. He especially should have done that in his memoir instead of that dismissive passage that he wrote about her that I read. Sorry, I'm going off my essay there for a minute.
I totally agree. Okay, we've talked about this a little bit just over text, but I think you actually may have enjoyed the movie more than I did.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing for me about the movie, I mean, Jean Ritchie not being featured in the movie at all was kind of wild to me, because even going in, I thought there would at least be a name drop at the very least.
Yeah.
There was absolutely nothing. But the other thing about that movie and just the way it sort of portrays women in general, even Joan Baez, it's almost like Joan Baez was stealing. At some point, it felt like they were trying to say that she was stealing Dylan's music.
Yep.
And when in reality, I'm like, I knew this whole situation with Masters of War. I'm like, is this trying to rectify Dylan's image in some way? I don't know. I have a tough time with movies like that. Also, I think this movie too, it's that classic trope of like, this man is such a creative genius and
Yep.
he's just so misunderstood. And you know, there were some like genuine, like there were some parts I really genuinely liked about the movie, but there was also so much in the movie. I mean, spoiler alert, I guess if people haven't seen it, that was just made up and totally
Right.
didn't happen. Johnny Cash being at that last
Yep.
Newport Folk Festival, not even that didn't happen. So
Right.
anyway, just the movie in general, I think missed the mark.
Right. Which is another reason it would have been smart to use Gene, because the women who are in the movie are really only there to fawn over Bob Dylan.
Exactly.
Even well, his girlfriend for sure, but also Joan Baez, an icon. She's sort of portrayed as, just sort of mesmerized by him, and she realizes there are issues with him, but still, she's only ever talking about him or to him, right?
Yep.
And so if they brought in Jean and her importance in the music and all that, it could have just complexified it and made it so much better. Well, but just back to the essay briefly, this is where things get a little bit complicated because this is folk music. And so the act of borrowing melodies is a long established tradition in folk music, right? However, that tradition is usually only seen as acceptable when a songwriter's identity is not known. So in this case, Ritchie had recorded her own family's arrangement with her own touches in 1951. 12 years later, Dylan uses that melody and gives them no credit. And so when she brought this up to him, he claimed that he didn't realize she was the author and assumed it was a songwriter lost to time. But now he knows, right? But instead of giving her credit, instead he turned it all over to his lawyers, and the lawyers offered her $5,000 against all future royalties. So like a flat fee, that's it for, a song that has sold millions of copies, etc. And this is documented in several places. And Jean actually told me this version herself. To their credit, most music scholars do now acknowledge her when they write about Masters of War. So that ends my reading from the essay. But I just love that she took Bob Dylan to task. And I think it says a lot about her strength and her defiance. And, at this time when he was the golden boy.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, and a big part of the movie towards the end is, these men of the folk festival sort of freaking out because he's going electric and all that. But again, it is so male centric. It's a lot. But and I know everything can't be covered in the film. We both realize that. But they could have spent 1 minute on Gene Ritchie and made this a better movie.
Yeah, I agree. Like even if it was not Bob even directly crediting Gene Ritchie to his, as an inspiration, like Joan Baez also didn't come out of nowhere.
Right. Yeah. And the woman who played Joan Baez did a terrific job with what she had. But anyway, yeah. So after that period, Jean turned her attention much more to environmental protest, especially in her music. And in doing so, she wrote masterpieces like Black Waters. If you haven't heard Black Waters, everybody out there, please listen to it. It's just one of the best songs ever about the unchecked devastation wrought by coal mining. She also wrote The Cool of the Day, which is a meditation on the holiness of the natural world, and it's now in church hymnals throughout the world. She also wrote The L&M Doesn't Stop Here Anymore, about how often the coal industry has left the people high and dry. And that's one of her most recorded songs. Johnny Cash recorded it, Billy Bragg, Kathy Mattea. And then artists such as Joan Baez, Dolly Parton, Judy Collins, Emmylou Harris, and Joni Mitchell have all credited her as an influence. I was really lucky to do an event with Joan Baez a couple of months ago, and I asked her about Gene Ritchie. And she just told me, that she was sort of awed by Gene, that she was intimidated by Gene because Gene was really serious about this stuff. And she, like I said earlier, she suffered no fools. And I think I think Joan Baez thought of her as being like the real deal in a way that intimidated her. And so she seemed to have a lot of respect for her. Jean had always played the dulcimer front and center, and she's widely considered as single handedly popularizing it from the 50s to the 70s. For many years, she and George even built dulcimers, and they shipped them to people all over the world. And this really came to a head in 1974 when she published a book called The Dulcimer Book. And people credit it as really teaching them how to play the dulcimer all throughout the United States and especially the UK. People such as Joni Mitchell, Cyndi Lauper, and Sarah McLachlan have all highlighted the dulcimer on their recordings and in their shows, and they have credited Jean Ritchie for doing that, which I think, further cements her as the mother of folk.
Yeah. Back to just thinking about dulcimers made me think of elementary school. I think this is maybe a uniquely Appalachian experience. Everyone got a dulcimer. I don't know if you all did this when you were in school, but we would get a dulcimer and we would have to learn one song on the dulcimer in our music class. Like it was forced on us. And I think about my aunt's house and other family members just having a dulcimer hung on the wall that no one plays. It just gets dusted every now and then. But it's like a heritage piece sort of thing or something in the house.
Yes. As I understand it, a dulcimer is originally, like its origins are, I guess, out of Eastern Europe, right? Germany. It's like a zither-based instrument, but the dulcimer, as we know it, that long, not the hammered dulcimer, was changed and shaped by Appalachian people to become a really quintessential American instrument in that way. And it's so centralized to Appalachia, sure. So Jean's 1974 album, Clearwater's Remembers, is a classic of environmental music. And then 3 years later, she recorded what many consider her finest album. It's called None But One, and Rolling Stone magazine chose it as their album of the year in 1977. And that garnered her a younger audience than she had for a long time. Personally, I really love her album, Mountain Born, which came out in 1995. She remained active in many ways over the last 50 years, and in the early 2000s, I was fortunate to get to know her, mostly through our mutual work of fighting mountaintop removal. So I first met her when we were both singing and talking about the issue. We were at a church in Harlem, in New York City, in 2006. And she had read my first 3 books, and she's mentioned in the first one a lot. And she liked those books. And so she just took me under her wing, and we remained close until her death in 2015. And she had suffered a stroke in 2009. So about 6 years, she was recovering from that stroke and, really changed by it. But one of my best memories of her is about a year before she died. She wasn't really able to talk to us, much more than nodding because of the stroke. But I just found this amazing. When we all sang, she sang with us. And she just, she just let her voice fly out of her when we were singing, even though she couldn't really talk to us. So I think it's just such a testament to the power of music, and how much it meant to her. The whole time I knew her, she was always singing. Like I said earlier, she had a song for everything. So I spent time with her in New York City doing environmental justice work. One time we did an event with Bobby Kennedy Jr., so that's a whole different story now. That's back when he was protecting the water.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, I visited with her at her home on Long Island. We spent time in Eastern Kentucky at protests and schools. And then she moved to Berea for the last 6 years of her life. And so I saw her quite a lot then. Her son, John, who passed away in 2020, told me that his mother was one of the most open-minded and open-hearted people he'd ever known, and that she was the earliest supporter of LGBTQ rights of anybody that he knew. And she certainly exhibited that to me and my husband, and the way she took us in and treated us. And her song, See That Rainbow Shine, should be a gay anthem. Look that one up on YouTube.
Yeah, I've never heard that one.
Oh yeah, it's a great one. It's not on Spotify or anything. You can only find it on YouTube and on like CDs,
Yeah.
That's why I keep all my CDs. I'm still hoarding CDs because so much of that stuff doesn't make it to
Hmm.
streaming. But by my count, she recorded 37 albums. She published 9 books. In 2002, she was awarded the National Heritage Fellowship, and that's awarded by the National Endowment for the Arts. And it's the highest honor for folk and traditional music in the nation. In 2008, the Library of Congress acquired her papers. And one time I was at her house, and just the whole living room was covered in her archives that she was organizing to turn over to the Library of Congress. So she was really proud that they were going to preserve that stuff, and like the best archive in the world now
Yeah.
has her papers. And so it's just a treasure trove. She told me so many stories, and it was truly one of the greatest honors of my life to know her. And one of the things that I try to do in my travels, and any chance I have, is to tell people about her, to remind them of her importance, and especially to hold up her books, and just remind people of how important she was and is to American music.
Yeah, I think what spurred me wanting to talk about Gene Ritchie with you was that piece, and then also just, I mean, obviously you knowing her, and I also know that you have such knowledge of the landscape of where sort of folk music is today and Appalachian music. And
Mhm.
I'm curious, who do you think, like, who comes to mind when you think about Jean, knowing Jean, her music, her writing, all that? Are there any artists that come to mind, women today, that sort of stand out to you carrying on her legacy?
I think the first person that comes to mind for me is S.G. Goodman, because, SG, as much as it's about, the sonic nature of the music, it's also about preserving the culture and complexifying notions of what it means to be rural, and the way that she uses protest, and all those things. I mean, I think you can draw a direct line from Gene Ritchie to somebody like S.G. Goodman. But I mean, I think anybody that I've ever known who's in the music world and really has a deep understanding of the history of music feels influenced by Gene Ritchie in some way, or feels a respect for her. And another person that comes to mind is Dawn Landis. She's originally from Louisville, and she recently released an album of songs. It's all about labor, and especially women's roles in labor. Caroline Herring is another one that really mixes protest and narrative storytelling. I mean, these are people who aren't worried about commerciality
Yeah.
as much as they're worried about making art, and about making art that changes things. And that's the way I think of Gene.
I hadn't actually made the connection to SG, but that makes so much sense now that you've said it. I remember her when she first sort of started getting popular, people comparing her to Hazel.
Yes.
And I feel like that Gene Ritchie comparison actually makes more sense to me.
Mhm.
I was going to ask, this is more for my own curiosity. She moved to Berea. Do you know why she moved to Berea? Like, was there a reason she just wanted to come back, or was she teaching?
I think the main reason she moved to Berea is that she had family there, and that especially like her nieces lived there.
Yeah.
And she lived to be pretty old, so most of her contemporaries had passed on. So she needed to be around younger members of the family to help take care of her, and they were just so good to her, and really saw to her in her last years, took such beautiful care of her. I think she also thought of Berea as one of the centers of Appalachian culture, especially around crafts traditions and things like that. So it was I think it had easy access to, like, medical facilities in Lexington and things like that. So I think it was sort of the best of both worlds for her.
Yeah.
Close to the mountains, but also close to medical access that sometimes Appalachian people are denied, and things like that.
Are there current members of like the Ritchie family that are still playing music and carrying the tradition on?
Yes, her nieces, they still sing at a lot, like more traditional music festivals. I mean, they're not going around touring in concert halls and bars and things, but traditional music stuff.
I've always wondered, like, why there isn't some sort of Gene Ritchie festival or something like that in Viper or just somewhere in Eastern Kentucky, just because
That's
of her
something else for
influence.
you to do, Jess.
Let me add it to my list
Right.
of all the things I should do. Yeah, I think there's really, I mean, how many folk festivals do we even have in Eastern Kentucky at all?
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Well, I'll have to, add that to my list of all the other things that I want to do. I
Yeah.
just need, if someone could spot me like $500,000, probably. I don't even know how much it would cost to put on a festival nowadays.
Yeah, that's the only problem, right?
Yeah.
But I'll help however I can. I'd love for that to happen.
Yeah, that would be pretty amazing. Besides the film about her family at Christmas, do you know if there's any other documentaries or anything about her life that people could check out?
KET made a really beautiful 1 hour documentary about her. It's called Mountain Born. It was made in the mid to late 90s. So it's pretty contemporary. It's really well done. There's a woman who does a Kentucky Chautauqua of her. So she goes around to schools, and she's dressed like Gene Ritchie, and she teaches kids songs and tells them the history of Gene Ritchie. There's also a woman, I think she's in New York State, who has a play about Gene that she tours. That's really, really well done. So, and like I said, the archives are in Galway and the Gene Ritchie lectures in Galway. So there are lots of people trying to keep, her legacy alive and protecting it, I think. One thing I wanted to be sure to tell people is one of my favorite novelists is Lee Smith. She's from Grundy, Virginia. And one of her best books is called The Devil's Dream. And in this book, she basically traces the history of country music from Civil War era up to modern times. And she does that through a fictionalized family that's based on Gene Ritchie's family and the Carter family. And she also has a character that's fictionalized version of Dolly Parton that's in that book. And so reading that book gives people a really, it illuminates the idea of the singing family. So if people are interested in that, check out The Devil's Dream by Lee Smith.
Yeah, the Carter family was the only other singing family I could think of whenever you started talking about that. And I also was like, oh, the Partridge Family came to mind, even though that's...
Well, there was a family in Perry County called the Combs family that were widely known for their reserve of old songs, and so Cecil Sharp visited them as well. So they're responsible for most of the songs out of Appalachia that have been preserved are due to the Ritchie family and the Combs family.
That's so amazing. Last question. What word, just based on your interactions with Gene, and what is there like a word that you would use to describe her, sort of, that maybe encompasses her personality and life?
Well, I think I've already said it a couple times, I think, but it's just the one that keeps coming to me. I think dignified. She was just always so dignified. And I would think of the word Appalachian too. She was just quintessentially Appalachian. And, like I said, she lived most of her life on Long Island. But when you stepped into that house, you were in Appalachia. The way it was decorated, the music, the food, she took her culture with her and she surrounded herself with it. And, and then after George died, she came straight back home. She came straight to Kentucky as soon as she could. I think she was just, she had that Appalachianness in her in such a deep way. It was just who she was. And to me, she epitomizes all the best things about Appalachia.
Well, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
You can find Silas's piece about Gene Ritchie, Bob Dylan, and a complete unknown on his Substack. Also, if anyone out there has the funds to get a Gene Ritchie Folk Festival started in Eastern Kentucky, reach out. I'm only half joking. Thank you so much for listening. This podcast is produced and edited by me, Jessica Miles. Our artwork is created by Hayden Miles, and our theme music is produced by Kenny and Hayden Miles. If you'd like to support the show, you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Mountain Laurels Podcast. You can also follow the show on Instagram and Blue Sky.